Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the Weekend Wellness Hour show. Thank you for joining us this weekend. We have Dr. Daniel Atkins, who is joining us today, and we met through a mutual friend who referred Daniel to me, Dr. Atkins to me, and we had a nice chat, and I wanted to bring him on because he is really well versed in the mind-body connection and how that can help us move into different states in our life. And thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Atkins.
Thanks so much, Amy. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And I would love it if you would share with us, because you started as a traditional kind of clinical psychologist and you've moved into another realm. And can you give us a little bit of a background on what happened in your life, why you are being led to do this, and kind of where you're at now?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll start, I think as most journeys or stories start with childhood, which is that, I always saw the world through an emotional lens, I would say. I really didn't even know there was another way to see it. I couldn't pay attention very much in school. I had lots of behavioral issues and things going on in my body, my nervous system, as you know very well about. And later on, I was it made sense that I really wanted to work with people in this way. As my journey evolved, the psychological world was one of the only things that made sense to me. It's what I studied in college, and then later on made sense that I wanted to pursue clinical psychological work. Alongside that, around 2011, after I had graduated college, I got very sick, debilitatingly sick. I received the label, which is widely misunderstood, though widely diagnosed, where in this country, we're big on labels and very light on explanations. So I got the diagnosis chronic fatigue syndrome, which really had no biomedical etiology and really no form of effective treatment. But it was the only label that doctors came up with for me. I felt like I had the flu every day. What would feel most relevant now is that it kind of felt like I had COVID every day, because I've had COVID and similar. Doctors were giving me all sorts of explanations. Some were telling me that I was depressed. So some were attempting to link it to emotional factors. But the truth is that, they had no understanding of, well, am I just depressed because I feel terrible? Or is there some underlying issues why these symptoms are manifesting? I was very confused. There was a lot of emotional strife because I had dealt with a lot of emotional conflicts from my early life. I received a lot of diagnoses as a kid. I sought substances for a while because that was the only way that I felt I could escape some of the intensity that I was coping with, which I would now call trauma, which I can talk about later. But so I got this diagnosis and I was pursuing this clinical path. And honestly, it was as right a path for me as I had come to see at that point, meaning, I felt very connected to it. I was good at it. I was clearly a good therapist. I understood conceptually and theoretically how to work with people, but I wasn't really getting better personally. So for a while I was going through grad school and still trying to achieve and impress my professors and my supervisors and really wanting to be a good therapist and all that, I was still coping and almost hiding with this personal experience of debilitating pain that I couldn't wrap my head around. And I was introduced along the way to what some might refer to as the field of mind-body medicine, meaning a field where it was fairly widely understood that emotional factors could influence and even manifest physical symptoms. And that started to make sense to me because I had not received any guidance from the traditional medical field. And even in the traditional psychological field, where you would expect people to be very comfortable with emotions, and even the theories that I were learning were theories about how emotions could manifest, as all sorts of experiences in the body. People in the psychological world were almost very frightened or hesitant to acknowledge anything that sounded too medical. And people in the medical field, emotions were like an alien language. So that is changing now. But at the time, it felt very segregated, and I felt very stuck So when I started discovering this work, it's now a much more burgeoning field. I started to read and understand, yeah, this totally makes sense to me, because there were conflicts. And even at my worst, even in the most debilitating states of pain and fatigue, it felt emotional. Like I could feel that I wasn't just upset about the symptoms. There was something, they came on not randomly, but at certain times. And as I got to understand the rhythm and flow of my symptoms, I came to see that there was some real emotional sort of roots here. And that continued for a while, and really not until I graduated, I got my degree. I ended up writing my dissertation on chronic fatigue syndrome and all of that. So I had a lot of information over that time. I learned a lot about the nervous system. I learned how to regulate what was a very dysregulated nervous system. For me, I learned that I had basically lived my entire life ruled by fear, ruled by my thinking brain and by fear. So I came to understand just how anxious a person I really was, even, after learning all this theory. As traditional psychologists, you're encouraged to go to therapy and things like that, but you're not really taught how to take care of yourself. So I kind of had to learn it on my own. And then what I would say as one of the most transformational parts of or shifts in my journey is that even as I was licensed and I was continuing to practice, is actually around when COVID hit. I was working from home. And I was still, after like 10 years, I was still getting sick like every day. And I knew that I had healed a bit. I knew that I'd come to understand some of my early life and some of what was contributing. But it was really not until I started to discover what I would call energy medicine, which is it's a very kind of abstract and kind of woo-woo word. But I mean, when you're desperate, you'll do just about anything. So I was meeting with people who called themselves shamans or clairvoyants or intuitives or mediums, people who I came to understand as just having different ways of knowing. And I've always been an open person, skeptical, but open. And for me, I because I was such a visceral person, I responded so well to touch. Some, practitioners who would call themselves energy workers could work on my body. And I could feel energy move through my body. And I could feel actually all my symptoms vanish. And that actually happened in experiences with what's called network chiropractic work, which is really not about cracking at all. They're lightly touching you. So they're just moving, they're releasing energetic blockages in the nervous system is what I learned. And they actually confirmed this with nodes on my nervous system, showing it all in red. And then a few months later, showing it more regulated. So my journey, it really wasn't about like one specific modality. I also, I stopped using substances. I eat all plant-based. I changed a lot of things about my lifestyle over time. But each modality was a window or a glimpse into what I was carrying, into the trauma, into sort of the energetic being that I am. And it sounds, again, it sounds abstract, but really, from the perspective of, let's say, physics, if you go from what we are, at a cellular level, a molecular level, an atomic level, and a subatomic level. I mean, it sounds wild, but we're really not that different from the chair that I'm sitting in. We're energetic material. So, energy can move in our body. And also, a lot of people know about this intuitively, but don't recognize it. Like, sports, for example, most people acknowledge that emotions influence performance in sports. Like even people who are not open to it in the healing journey at all, if I were to say, what do you think happens when a team goes into halftime in the locker room? Like, what do you think the coach is doing? Do you think he's like just giving them really strategic information? Maybe, but he's also he's accessing their he's giving them a pump-up speech. Yep. He's like, we need to go out and win, right? If they left the locker room and emerged and we're like, we're going to get killed. Like there's literally nowhere. Do you like, most people would acknowledge, yeah, that's probably going to matter, in like the Super Bowl. But if they feel pumped up and enlivened, their beliefs and their emotion energy will actually contribute to their performance on the field. So I really started to understand emotion as energy in the body, and emotions, I think when we talk about the word trauma, which I'll talk about, Emotions get a really bad rap. Emotions, most of us from our early life are just not, specifically with parents from older generations, emotions were never things that were talked about, were never things that were acknowledged or made space for, or even really understood. So basically, because our brains are trained to survive, as kids, we sort of model and experience, emotions should be pushed away and kind of kept out of our experience, and we'll do anything to do that. So, whether it's with food or substances or other kinds of, or just dissociation or fantasy, any ways that we can escape emotion, our brain will, basically learn to do. But really, the way that we heal, unlike in most things where logic and reason in the thinking brain are very useful, like, if you're an accountant or if you're in real estate or whatever, it's very good to be smart and logical. But when it comes to emotions, that skill and strength is really not so useful because emotions live in the body. They don't live in the thinking head. So it's really helpful to come to understand how to get in touch with the body, to understand that emotions are meant to flow through. People who say, I really don't like crying, I really hate crying. Crying is actually, maybe because in some ways in our culture we associate it with weakness, but it represents a beautiful vulnerability and allowing emotion to move through. And that's how we heal. So over time, even after years of traditional clinical practice and my own therapy, I had still not felt safe enough in my body to really understand how emotion as energy can move through. And I started to have experiences where the morning time used to be the worst for me. So those who are familiar with this kind of condition, like I would wake up and feel like I couldn't get out of bed, like I was going to be sick, like whatever. I started to transform that time. So I started to get up really early, and I continued this practice. I get up around like 4:30 in the morning, and I have a practice where, I would meditate and I would start to visualize. I would start to visualize the energy flowing through my body. And I started to see my physical state would literally change. And I would start to have these experiences that I could only describe as like emotional seizures. Like I could feel it. It sounds so funny, but I could feel it moving up my spine and releasing like it's real energetic matter. They're not just these abstract ideas. And it's interesting, again, because in the traditional Western clinical world, we talk so much about emotion, but a lot of it is intellectualized, particularly in grad school. It's not very experiential. So you could learn so much about the subject matter, but rarely may you have the opportunity to experience it. So I was experiencing a lot of this for the first time. And as I started to do this, and I started to heal, my symptoms started to go away, I started to get better. The really interesting thing about this, and this is what I share with clients, is the idea that you have when you're really sick is like, man, I would do anything for these symptoms to just go away and get back to my life. What you realize when you start to heal is there is no going back, because a lot of what was manifesting as symptoms was the way we were living our lives, which was totally out of alignment, which was escaping our emotions, which was pursuing things that weren't in our best interest, which was really, like, to use sort of frequency language, vibrating at a lower frequency in emotions of shame or blame or despair or guilt, which I was carrying for most of my life. And as I started to heal, my life just started to change. This is when I started to change my lifestyle a lot. And I recognized I was no longer meant to serve in a traditional clinical capacity. I was no longer comfortable diagnosing my clients, because I came to see that a lot of the boxes we were putting people in with good intention, at some point throughout history, with the intention of helping people understand their mind-body experience. Well, here's a label of depression or anxiety or OCD. This is the best way we have, the best tool we have to help you understand what's going on. And that's great. The only thing now is that it's a little outdated, because even at the time, we knew these were just collections of symptoms. These weren't touching the roots of your experience, what I would call your trauma. So I was no longer comfortable with that. And I was no longer comfortable with some other aspects of the clinical world, which was, a kind of dependency in the caregiving relationship. Like, well, you're going to see this person once, twice, maybe even 3 times a week. Maybe it'll take 8, 10 years. And I was like, that I don't think it has to be that way. I think there's a more expansive way, a more holistic way to do this work. So I started integrating all of what I was learning in addition to my, so I still tell people, I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, but I practice much more holistically. And along the way, I actually started to discover, that I was highly intuitive. And I can talk about that a little later, but I just started to integrate a lot of parts of my experience.
Yeah, and that completely makes sense. Even just when we think about something I want to touch on, when you're mentioning visualization, sometimes that gets a bad rap. But if you think about, I just want to just take you back a little bit. When you're a kid, you visualize you winning. We teach our kids that all the time, but somehow we lose that skill. And there's so much that we lose on our journey to getting older that we forget. And the same thing with crying. We're okay to let kids cry sometimes we're not.
Yeah.
But we have this shame when we cry, even females. I mean, notoriously adults, we think of females as crying all the time, but there is so much shame that's related to crying. And I'll talk to people and say, no, let it loose. Like, think how good you feel after you've had a good cry. There's a reason we have this process. Humans have this ability to cry. It's a necessary process that we go through. And it's great how you've kind of gone through your journey and discovered this, for you, and now you're teaching others this mind-body connection and how it can actually enhance your life. It's impressive.
Yeah, thank you. And, I think you're totally right. I've often thought about, rather than, teaching kids in kindergarten how to count blocks and whatever else we learned, what if we taught kids how to be with sadness and how emotions are okay? How much more healing, how much more prepared would we be to heal? Because we're really not taught these things. And to your point on visualization, kids are so naturally creative, unless, the kids that have trouble are usually the ones that have more trauma or more sort of distortion in their experience, or, more anxiety. But naturally, we all have people who say, I'm not creative. It's really not true. We're all inherently creative beings. We have the ability to fantasize and create and visualize. And visualization is a very powerful way to send messages to the brain. We talk about words or the power of affirmations or the energy of words, but visuals, in our mind, are such powerful messengers to really direct our brain to produce certain things in the body.
Absolutely. And kind of touching on children, can you talk about the fact that as children, we have experiences in our household? You mentioned a little bit, you had some difficulties when you were younger. Maybe the family lifestyle, maybe trauma that we have as a kid. How does that impact our ability to handle stress, emotions, and go through life? Because I have heard that there are definitely some impact of what happens to us in the very early years, baby, toddler age, and how that impacts us as we handle stress and move through life later.
Yeah. So this is the core of my life's work, I would say. Is really this idea of trauma. It's a very buzzy word now. People may have heard the word, even if they're not sure what it means. And I think when words get very buzzy, it's a good thing in the sense that it gets a lot of exposure, but it can lose its meaning because it's used so widely. So specifically, I like to simplify it. When we talk about trauma, specifically emotional trauma, really what I'm saying is beliefs we have about ourselves, others in the world, and associated emotions. And so particularly what's widely understood in the traditional Western clinical world is that as we come into the world, we experience our caregivers, and we're very susceptible to their beliefs that they have about themselves, others in the world. And our brains are very pliable. They're like Play-Doh. The clinical word is neuroplastic. And so they absorb things like a sponge, particularly very early in life, from like 0 to 7. And so we just start to inherit and absorb beliefs about ourselves, others in the world. So if it's an environment that does not support sadness, or does not support anger, or does not support even a sense of worthiness or success, we will start to adopt those beliefs. Or if it's, for example, you're not a worthy person unless you achieve and you get straight A's, it varies, yeah, right. Most of us can relate to these experiences. So we adopt them, and they literally start to, I can't emphasize this enough, the beliefs really, they create our personal reality. It's like we're wearing filtered glasses with the beliefs written over them. The way we see the world, the way we interpret information is through these beliefs we hold. And in my opinion, all beliefs come with associated emotions. So if there's a belief that the world is an inherently scary and untrustworthy place, there may be an associated emotion of fear. And so we're just carrying around this fearfulness with this belief. And that is really conditioned, and over time, the way I talk about it is kind of like with a metaphor of food. If you eat McDonald's every day, you kind of know what's going to start happening to your body. Well, if you are feeding your brain the messages of a certain belief and emotion every day, it's like feeding your brain, and it's a negative one, which most of ours are. It's like feeding your brain McDonald's from the inside every day. So it starts to get conditioned and actually addicted to the belief and emotion. Just like we can get addicted to McDonald's, it tastes good. So your brain is like, and more than that, we start to identify who we are with the belief. I'm actually just a depressed person. That's just who I am, because it's who I've always been, rather than understanding, this is just how our brains and our nervous systems have been conditioned. And it's really hard to tease it apart. But one of the primary aspects of healing is understanding that the belief in the emotion, it's not who we are. It's a trauma we've been carrying. And where I go in my work, which is, I think, a step further and a very necessary step, is that beyond early life, it makes sense that we don't come into this world as blank slates. Like, we don't come in as a blank whiteboard and then just get filled up with all the beliefs and emotions of our environment. That matters. It certainly does. But we come in carrying some stuff. We come in carrying the unresolved conflicts of those who came before us. And this is the field of what I call the epigenetics of trauma, or some might call it intergenerational trauma or ancestral trauma. Research is showing that upwards of 3+ generations back is carried forth. So it's, and it makes sense that it's not just, if we come in with genetic information dictating how tall we are and the color of our eyes, it makes sense we might come in carrying some other stuff, specifically the beliefs. So when I work with people, they may be carrying emotions and beliefs, not, and some people will say, yeah, but nothing like crazy happened to me as a kid. Like, there wasn't one instance of like abuse or neglect. And it's like, well, what were your parents' childhoods like? And then they're like, oh, well, yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on. And usually there is. And so we carry some ancestral stuff too. And ancestral trauma plus early life trauma, what I would say is it's not, it's not the only thing. There are certainly life circumstances that impact our experience. But from where I'm standing on the spectrum of healing, it was the defining factor in a lot of my experience and my healing, and a lot of the individuals that I work with.
And that makes sense too. If we think about, if we're bringing something from generation to generation, we also have to realize that we can change things too. Like when you bring in energy medicine. So just as we often like labels, chronic fatigue syndrome, depression, when we're given a label, that is often considered an endpoint, where people think, okay, I have this label, boom, I'm done. That's just the way I am. Instead of thinking, okay, I've been given this label, but does that really mean that's just who I am? That's not really my identity. We can learn to move through it and look at the journey of how can we adjust or change, which is part of kind of the process you're talking about. Is we're not just a static being. We have been programmed to be a certain way, but just as we were programmed to be one way, which led to this label, we can program ourselves to be another way and get out of that label. And so I really appreciate you talking about that, because if we hear that, the way we are and our beliefs and how we approach things is based on 3 generations, it doesn't mean it's the end all. And I would love if you would cover kind of how you approach that and say, okay, this is where you're at. You've been programmed. How do we move forward now?
Yeah, and you're totally right in the sense that we're the human experience. We're here to grow and expand. That's what we're here to do. We're not here for stuckness. So that was one of my biggest gripes with what I was feeling in the traditional Western clinical world, which is that you got these labels, and clinicians themselves could not help but start to believe, speaking of conditioning, that, yeah, you're going to be able to manage this, but you'll probably always have it. And it was unacceptable to me because it was so limiting about the possibilities of human experience. I carried sadness for the majority of my life. And I know, it's not to say that I don't have sadness, but I no longer have the quality of the depressive experience that really dominated. I mean, my life is totally different. I mean, like at a cellular level, it's I can't even begin to describe how great it is, honestly. So I really want to bring that possibility to people about how we change and grow. And yeah, so a lot of the idea, there's a lot to learn and to know, and a lot I could say about what I would call the epigenetics of trauma, about the ancestry of it. Part of my intuitive gifts are that I can pretty clearly identify in people where trauma comes from. But without having even to go into the specifics of that, the main point, the main hope, the main invitation is to initially see that the trauma is not you. That's where we always start, because once we start to see that what we're carrying is not us, we automatically get a little space from the experience. Like if you ate something, and it was, and you got a bad stomach ache, you wouldn't say, oh my God, this is who I am now. I am this food. I am the stomach ache. I am this food poisoning. You would say, I shouldn't have eaten that food and I won't eat it again, but it'll pass. And there's a huge qualitative difference in seeing that what we're carrying are like waves of emotion. And if we allow them to move through us, they will release, and we will get closer to the truth of who we are, which in my humble opinion is way more expansive, way more like the ocean, way more like love and gratitude and these high frequency emotions. And so that is really the beginning of all journeys. Then there's a lot of modalities and a lot of practices that I use, just as I know you do, like breath work and meditation and visualization. And if we need to address things like diet and movement and really accessing some of what the emotions and beliefs are and the trauma, and talking about it and providing education. And there's lots of things, like some of the modalities I mentioned when we were speaking earlier, like a specific kinds of energy practices and yoga and all kinds of things. What I will say is that I think we have a habit in this society of getting very attached to the modality. Like it was yoga that healed me and changed my life, or it was kale that healed me and changed my life, or it was or it was plant medicine, it was ketamine, it was whatever, and I'm a fan of all of these modalities, including plant medicines. But it's very important to see, in my opinion, that the healing and the healer is activated within. The modalities are just a window or a glimpse. So, I have a daily practice, but I don't push my daily practice on everyone I work with. I want to discover what is going to resonate with you. Is it breath, for example, is one of the most powerful energy medicines that we have. When we bring breath into the body, it activates what's called the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic state, which is the state in our body that creates relaxation and peace. And through that, it allows emotions to release. So breath work is super powerful. And maybe we just start there. But rather than what I like to say is, healing is an art, not an algorithm. It's a practice, not a pill. So I don't give people a prescription for exactly how to heal. We're going to discover what tools may work for you, and I can share, but we'll see what entryway, what key is going to fit in your lockbox of a mind.
Right. And I love that because we're all different and our experiences in our past have made us who we are today. So you can't just have one recipe that fits everyone. So when we talk about energy and we're talking about energy medicine and releasing blockages, if you have a client who's a little bit more on the religious side and is not used to talking about energy in that way, how do you address those concerns?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's really, for religious or not religious people, it can be a concern regardless, because it feels, for people who, let's say, are only interested in the gold standard of, placebo-controlled double-blind research, which I'm a fan of. Great that we have research, but energy medicine is hard to quantify in that way too. So what I'll say for all people is energy medicine, it doesn't have to be a religion. It doesn't have to even be a philosophy. Like, regardless of whether you believe there is meaning outside yourself, whether there is a creator, whether there is a spiritual realm, we can, energy is just a word that can represent, the physical sensation of what it means to be alive. Like, I think most people would identify when you walk into a room, if it's a party, where there's just like really good energy, everyone's having an amazing time and you feel immediately comfortable. Like, how would you describe that? How would you describe what that feeling is? Is it just like, would you say, well, those are just the neurochemicals in my brain producing blah, blah, blah? Like, sure, but like, there's an energy to the experience. And I would say, to go further, I would say you're picking up on an emotion energy, because we're all, again, like from a physics perspective, sort of the biological substrate, like the core material of what we are, is energetic matter. That's just sort of a word to describe, at the smallest level of what we are. That's what it is. And when we relate with people, or when we put food in our body, right? People identify food as energy. The thing that I will push people on a little bit is there's an idea in our country specifically that energy is either like you have it or you don't. Like, do you have energy today? Or do you need an energy drink? If you want energy, eat these kinds of foods or drinks, and they're usually all terrible for you. Yep. And it's a total misunderstanding of energy. I would talk about, rather than I have energy today or I don't, energy is more like a rainbow, like a spectrum. We're always at some level of energy. It just might be negative or low, or when there's heaviness and sadness, or when there's lightness and love and gratitude. And so that doesn't have to be like a religious, like namaste experience. Like, it can just be very practical. Like, how does it, like breath, like bringing breath into the body. Do you feel that? What happens when you breathe out? Do you feel that? It can be very experience-based, and we don't have to I'm pretty woo-woo. Like, I'm pretty connected to the spiritual world, but we don't have to go there at all to help you benefit from what I would call feeling energy move in your body, because really a lot of it is that most of us are, and which I was as well, led by the thinking brain. Even we're talking about kids and conditioning. A lot of us are taught, think before you speak, be thoughtful, think before you act. And I started to learn, just because of the way my brain was wired, it was very hard for me. I had a lot of emotional intensity that was distorting my thinking. Mm-hmm. So I started asking, is anyone considering that thinking isn't so helpful sometimes? Like, I personally, it really wasn't that great for me, and it was getting in my way a lot of the time. So it's helping people connect to their heart and their gut, which, religious or not, I think people agree we have a heart and a gut, and research shows that there's a lot more neuronal connections in the heart and the gut sending messages to the brain, then vice versa. So there's a lot of, religious, spiritual, atheist, whatever, all research points to there's a lot more information in here being sent up here and vice versa. So one way to understand energy medicine is just helping people connect to what's in here.
Absolutely. And I know you have a program you call Be the Vessel. So it's that kind of ties into this, where your body is this vessel, and I'm going to let you explain it more, but I can see how the two tie together.
Yeah. So on a very basic level, what I started to feel was that, again, as I mentioned, there's very practical purposes for logic and reason and for using the thinking brain and the prefrontal cortex. Like, I'm not saying, don't use your brain. Like, our brains are powerful. They're very powerful computers, but just like computers, computers are only as good as their programming, right? Like, if your computer has a bunch of viruses, it's not going to be that helpful to use. And all of our brains are conditioned in some way. And my brain was conditioned with a lot of stuff that wasn't helpful. And so a lot of healing happens when we go beneath the thinking brain into the body. There's a lot of what I would call intuitive wisdom. Now, intuition is another word that kind of strikes people as a little funny. They're not really sure what it means. It sounds kind of abstract or made up. But on one level, intuition could be understood as understanding the very natural wisdom and the information that the body collects that is not dictated by sort of how the brain is conditioned, by the unconscious belief systems that are sort of creating that personal reality, by the McDonald's that we're feeding it every day. It's a different kind of wisdom that actually is much closer to what I would say is the truth of who we are. Because, if we really ask ourselves, do we think we're just our brains? Like, is that like who we are? Is that our identity? I would say very clearly no. And there's a lot of parts of us, our heart, our gut, other parts of our body that speak much more to who we are, what we actually want in this world. It's why the question of, that sort of age-old question of, if you had all the money in the world, like, what would you want to do? A lot of people are like, I have no idea, And the reason they have no idea is because they're listening to this, and the thinking brain is just conditioned to survive. So it's not really thinking about your highest vision or possibility. That's all in here, all the creativity and inspiration and, highest vision for your life is in here. So being the vessel is about, through breath, through movement, through meditation, through the visualizations that I lead, it's about creating space for what we're meant to create in this world. In my opinion, spiritual, religious, whatever, I believe we all come here with a purpose. That's my particular belief. I don't believe we're just here randomly. I believe we came into this world, each of us, to bring something, to be of service in some way to ourselves and others. And my mission for myself and others is to help, not just to help people get out of pain, but getting out of pain is really just the first step. What I tell people who are so obsessed with getting rid of their symptoms, I'm like, I know it sounds weird, but this isn't even really about your symptoms. It's about what the symptoms are keeping you from. Because we all have something to create, to build, to contribute to. So being the vessel is allowing ourselves to get in touch with what is meant to come through. And it's amazing when we start to quiet this part, we naturally just, what? I think I'm meant to write a book, or I think I'm meant to change my job, or I think I'm meant to change my relationship, or, there's a lot of areas of our life where there's stuckness that the thinking brain, the survival brain, has just been keeping us in because of fear. Well, it's safe, I'll make a certain amount of money, and, I know this person will always be there for me, even though that's not true. And there's just a lot of beliefs we adhere to and stay in because of perceived safety. And once we start to quiet that part, we can and quiet the fear, we allow a more expansive version of what our life could be to come through. And that's really what using the body as a vessel. And there's an extended metaphor for there in the way that I work with intuition, but on a basic level, using the body as a vessel to understand what's meant to come through for our lives.
That's wonderful. And I like how you really take people on a journey, and it's a process, and you're very upfront about that. That's absolutely wonderful, because sometimes we think just that pill, boom, you're done, but it's not.
I wish. I mean, if it was that simple, I would be
You-
very happy. I tried it that way. It didn't work.
It didn't work for you. So how can people reach you? And you work with people virtually, so anywhere in the world, I assume. So how can people reach you?
Yeah, yeah. I work all virtually. There are some in-person workshops, but I also do virtual workshops and virtual in-person offerings. And people can reach me through my website, drdanielatkins.com, or they can shoot me an email at drdanielatkins at gmail.com.
That's wonderful. We really appreciate your time. Any last piece of advice or words that you want to say before we wrap up?
My invitation is for people to know the truth of who they are, which is way more expansive, way more powerful than our conditioned brains and our conditioned beliefs often give us credit for.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time on this Saturday. Really appreciate it. And
Thank you so much, Amy. It's really my pleasure.
Wonderful. And thank you all for joining us today. It was wonderful talking to Dr. Atkins here and picking his brain a little bit, just learning more about what he does. Please take advantage of reaching out to him. He'd be a great resource on your healthcare and mental health team. So thank you again. Have a great rest of your weekend. We'll see you again next week. Bye now.